So thank you so much to everyone for coming to our October Empowering Caregivers workshop. And thank you for being flexible with us when we needed to change the dates. Um, a reminder, everyone's audio will be on mute. If you unmute yourself, I will mute you again, so please don't do that. Um, Emma and Lauren will be asking for participation via chat. If you need help with that, you can let me know and I'm happy to help. We are recording today, but your face and name will not appear anywhere on the recording. So it'll just be Emma, Lauren, and their PowerPoint. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenters. Dr. Emma Rhodes is a neuropsychologist with the Penn Frontotemporal Degeneration Center, the FTD Center, and an assistant professor of neurology at the Perelman School of Medicine. She completed her PhD in clinical psychology at Temple University, a pre-doctoral internship in neuropsychology at UCSD, and a postdoctoral fellowship in geropsychology and neuropsychology at UCSF and the San Francisco VA Medical Center. Her research focuses on social and emotional dysfunction and behavioral variant FTD, the impact of psychosocial factors such as mood and personality on cognitive outcomes, and mechanisms of neuropsychiatric symptoms in dementia. She also provides comprehensive neuropsychological evaluations for patients with a wide range of neurologic and psychiatric conditions. And our co-presenter is Lauren Fisher, who's a PhD candidate in the School of Nursing at the University of Pennsylvania and a research assistant at the Frontotemporal Degeneration Center. For her dissertation, she's investigating the relationship between empathy loss in behavioral variant FTD and care partner outcomes, such as stress. Her research interests include emotional changes in dementia, interpersonal changes with caregiving, and improving care for persons living with dementia and their care partners. So welcome to both of you. I'm going to hand it over to you. Last little announcement is if anyone needs the paper that Lauren and Emma are going to be referencing, if for some reason you didn't receive it, please message me either in the chat here or via email, and I will send you another copy. All right, take it away.
Thanks so
Emma,
much,
I just see
Allison.
that, sorry, your name says that you're me under you. Do you see that? Your header is Lauren Fisher
Oh,
for
I
your
don't see that.
display name.
Oh my gosh, you're right. That's so weird. Huh.
That's what Mr. Douglas is pointing out in the chat.
Very strange. There must be some kind of computer glitch going on. I'm Emma Rhodes, not Lauren Fisher. You're welcome to call me Lauren Fisher. For the next hour or so, I will respond to that. But hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you, Allison, so much. Lauren and I are both very excited to be here to talk to you today about how to read a research paper. So this is something that I think can be intimidating for some folks, but it's great to understand scientific writing. And so even for those without a scientific background, we want to offer some tips and tricks for sort of digesting scientific writing. And we're actually going to go through the paper that was sent out and sort of use that as an illustration of some of our pointers and tips. And hopefully, we'll all walk away having learned something new from that article. Oh, and happy Halloween. I am not in costume, but my dog is dressed as a dragon right now. So. Okay, what we are going to cover today is we'll start off by talking about what is included in most research papers. So I call this the anatomy of a research paper. So we'll talk about the different sections, what usually is presented in those sections, and what's sort of important to look out for in the different areas of a research paper. Then Lauren is going to talk to us a bit about pointers or tips for reading a research paper to keep in mind as we go through the paper in the third section and as you read papers from here on out. So I'm hoping that today's talk will be a nice sort of foundation that you'll be able to carry with you into sort of future attempts to read scientific manuscripts. So we will close out by reviewing the paper written by some of our lovely colleagues at the Memory Center and have a bit of a discussion with you guys about what that experience was like. So To get started, the research papers that are published typically have pretty standard components. And so there are major sections of research papers that are common across pretty much all papers that are published in scientific literature. This can vary a little bit depending on the discipline. So if you're reading, an organic chemistry paper or theoretical physics, they may have slightly different sections or in a slightly different order. But in general, when we're talking about medical research or psychological research or nursing research, then we're going to typically see a lot of the same sections and often in the same order. And so understanding what goes where can really help you pick out, when you're looking for a specific piece of information, figuring out where to go to find that. So we're going to go through all of these major sections and talk about what their purpose is. So first and foremost, we have the abstract of a paper. So oftentimes you'll see this when on the first page, sort of on the title page underneath the authors. And this is essentially a snapshot or a brief summary of the paper. So the purpose of this is to really give the reader a preview of what the paper is going to be about, how the project was executed, and what the primary findings were. And so this is really helpful because a lot of times when we are trying to find papers, to read for pleasure or for work, we are not quite sure how relevant they're going to be just based on the title. And so the abstract gives us a better sense of what was done and whether or not we want to read the whole paper. So it can tell you, oh, it looks like they're studying this in a different population. I'm not so interested in that. Maybe I'll find something else. Or it gives you, a teaser of things that you really are more curious about and makes you want to read the rest of the paper. So typically, abstracts will be broken down into discrete sections like the purpose or background, the methods, a section on the results, and then finally the conclusion. And these are often somewhere between 150 and 500 words. So they really are designed to be very brief and contain, the highlights of the paper. And so a good abstract should identify, the purpose or the gap in knowledge that the paper is filling, the main question of the paper that addresses this knowledge gap. It will describe, key methods and results, summarizing them very briefly. And then the conclusions will be very broad. So it's really kind of the broadest application of what we've learned from this study. So as I mentioned, this gives you sort of a roadmap of where the paper is going to go and is really helpful in deciding whether or not you want to spend your time reading the whole thing. After the abstract, the first section you typically see is the introduction. And so this outlines the basis for the study. So this will tell you about relevant background information. And essentially, this means what has already been done in this area. So if we have identified a topic like insight and quality of life in Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment, then the introduction is going to summarize, all of the scientific work that has already been done on that topic. So what does the field already know? And importantly, it's going to highlight what we don't know. So an important reason why papers get published is because they are novel or they are telling us something that we don't already know. And so a good introduction will identify what that gap is and how this paper is going to fill that gap. So oftentimes there will be a summary of previous studies. And for different disciplines, this varies in terms of how detailed you want to get. So I'll say that in psychology, the literature reviews in the introduction can be quite long and maybe several pages long, whereas in medical journals, they often want really short introductions, maybe one, maybe two paragraphs. And they expect you to really cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time. And so this will give the reader a sense of, what the relevant background is. And most introductions, I would say all good introductions, are also going to identify the aims of the paper and the hypotheses or what they expect to find. And so this, again, really drives home for the reader what the purpose of the study is. And it should link directly to the analyses they do and the methods and the way that they report their results. And so I think that the aims and hypotheses of a paper are really one of these kind of top 10 things I would want to look for and identify and make sure I understand when I'm reading a paper, because the aims are going to be present throughout the rest of the paper. It's going to shape how they present the results and how they describe the conclusions. So having a really good hold on what the aims of the study are, the purpose, is really helpful. Most authors will also put in their hypotheses or what they expect to find. Sometimes there's so little work done in an area that they just don't know, and that's okay too. So if it's a really novel area of research, they can say, we don't know what we're going to find. This is maybe exploratory. But if based on what's already been done, they have a reasonable expectation that they suspect they know what the results will be, then we want them to put that here so we can see, did they find what they expected to find? And most of the time, you will find this information in the last paragraph of the introduction. And introductions in general, they start off very broad. And as you read, they should get more and more narrow. And so ultimately culminating in that final paragraph, where we're really talking about, okay, what is this paper going to be showing us? So as you read through an introduction, it's helpful to kind of think critically to yourself about, does this argument make sense? Is the justification for this paper valid? Are there gaps in their logic? And do we really think that this will add new knowledge, compared to what we already know? After the introduction, there's typically the methods section. So in some journals, they put the methods at the end. I think this is terrible. I really think the methods should always go after the introduction, because this tells you how the study was done. I will say that for most people who don't come from a scientific background, this is one of the most dense sections and is often full of jargon and confusing terms and things that you may not be familiar with. And the reason why the methods are so detailed and oftentimes so confusing is that the purpose of this section is really to allow other researchers to understand and critique how you did the study to the extent that they should be able to replicate it. So your method section as a scientist should be so detailed and explicit that somebody else on the other side of the world who has never met you before should be able to read your methods and execute your study the same way, based solely on reading your method section. So it often seems really dense and hard to read, but there's a reason for that. And it actually helps us in science sort of replicate our findings and make sure that what we're finding is consistent across samples. So there are some really important features of the method section that will be consistent sort of regardless of what particular techniques they used. And so those I think are important to highlight. One that is really important for human subjects research is inclusion and exclusion criteria. So these will tell us who was included in the study, and it often is going to define how we identified our main group of interest. So, for example, if we're interested in studying patients with Alzheimer's disease, we want to know, okay, what diagnostic criteria were used to establish that diagnosis and say, yes, we know for sure that the people included in the study have Alzheimer's disease because we used, these published criteria that have been validated and accepted by the field. Sometimes we also include groups of people that we call controls or comparison samples, and these tend to be healthy individuals who do not have the disease of interest, right? So if Alzheimer's disease is the condition we're interested in studying, we may compare a group of individuals with Alzheimer's disease to people who are healthy and without Alzheimer's disease, so that if we identify differences between those groups, we can say we think it's because of the disease. And we don't see the same pattern in individuals who are healthy. But it's important that when we do this, when we identify healthy controls, that they be similar to our disease group in other ways, like how old they are, how many men and women are in the sample, how educated they are, so that we feel more confident that anything we find is really due to the disease and not due to these other differences, right? So if we had a healthy comparison sample who was in their 20s or their 30s, and the disease of interest was Alzheimer's, we couldn't be certain that any differences between those groups weren't due to age. And so we typically want our healthy controls to be, the same age range, same sex distribution, and similar in a lot of ways. So you will often find this in the paper by looking for terms about inclusion and exclusion. So phrases like we included patients with a clinical diagnosis of BVFTD, or all patients had is another way of saying this is something that we specifically recruited people for and was required to be included. And then sometimes you will see controls referred to as a reference group or a comparison group. And then for exclusion, we want to make sure we're not putting people in the study who have other conditions that might influence the data. So we will often exclude people who have other medical or psychiatric conditions, people who don't speak English, people who cannot read at an eighth grade level, things like that. So if we have a reasonable suspicion that these characteristics may impact whatever topic it is we're trying to study, we often won't include them in our research. And so these are just examples from other papers about the kind of language to look for that sort of dictates our inclusion-exclusion criteria. The other sections of the methods typically outline the different tools we use to measure our outcomes. This can be things like questionnaires, it can be blood tests, it can be brain imaging, right? So if we're interested in measuring a particular outcome, we want to know exactly how they did that. And this is really where it's helpful to other researchers to see, oh, how did they do that exactly? And let me see, if I have the means to do something similar. And the last paragraph typically outlines the statistical tests, and often it has a header called statistical analysis. This is a section that for folks who have never done statistics can often seem very confusing. But I do want to highlight one thing that I think can be helpful to understand and try to pull out of this section, and that is the difference between an independent and a dependent variable. So in a scientific study, we have to identify what is our outcome or dependent variable, and what are the predictors we're interested in, or the independent variables. And so if we think of a study where, let's say, the aim of the study is we're going to study the effect of psychotic symptoms on caregiver burden in FTD, then the outcome there is caregiver burden, because that's what we're measuring, and we're interested in seeing how the psychotic behavior affects caregiver burden. So then the psychosis is the predictor or the independent variable, and the caregiver burden is the dependent variable. And so in these examples, you see the study tests the effect of meditation on stress. Again, effect of something on another thing gives you a nice clue as to what's what. If we are measuring the effect of something, that is typically an independent variable or a predictor. And if we're measuring the effect of that on something else, that is typically our outcome or our dependent variable. We've been seeing, a lot of studies in the literature for the past few years about lecanemab, or Leqembi, one of our FDA-approved medications for Alzheimer's disease. So in this example, I just want to see if there's anybody. Feel free to type it in the chat if you think you know the answer to this. If we say we assessed the impact or the effect of lecanemab on memory performance, which one do you think might be the outcome or the dependent variable, and which one do you think might be the predictor or the independent variable. So I'll give just a few seconds to see if anybody has any ideas here.
Are you able to see the chat, Emma? Otherwise, I
I
can be the
am.
reciter. Okay.
Yeah, so Marcia chimed in and said that the outcome there would be the memory performance, and that's exactly right. So memory performance here is our dependent variable. And then by exclusion, that means that lecanemab or Leqembi would be our predictor or our independent variable. Great job. So just something to keep in mind as we move forward and we think about the paper that we'll review in a little bit. These are sort of factors that we want to keep in mind, for any paper that we're interested in. Let's see. I want to go back and just highlight at the bottom here, as you read a method section, try not to get too bogged down in the weeds here. These are intended to be technical and detailed, but I will say that I read papers now and there are things in the methods that I don't fully understand, and that's because it's not my specialty area. If I read a neuroimaging paper or a biofluid biomarkers paper, so it's not the kind of research I do, and so when I read those sections, I don't expect myself to understand everything that's in the methods. And I think that people without a scientific background should keep that in mind and really don't expect yourself to understand everything that is in here. But if there are things that you're really curious about and you want to aid your understanding, there are things that can be Googled or searched, and I think that there's a lot of good information out there. Obviously, not everything on the internet is true. But at this point, there is a lot of information that can be useful. And so if there's something that you want to know more about, I would encourage you to do a little bit of research as you're reading. Okay. Up next, we have the results section. And this is where we say, okay, based on, here's how we did the study. Now here's what we found. And so oftentimes, especially for human subjects research, the first table that's presented in the results, called table 1, will be a summary of the characteristics of the sample. So this is saying, here are the people we included in the study. Here's on average how old they are, how educated they are. Here's how they performed on various tasks or surveys. And this just gives us an overview of who's in the study and how they're doing. Then later tables and figures will be used to highlight the main findings. So oftentimes there's going to be multiple tables and figures alongside text in the results. And they're supposed to be complementary. So the tables and figures are really pulling out kind of the most important findings that the researchers want you to know about. And the text gives you additional details. And you're not supposed to be redundant between the two. So if something is reported in a table or a figure, you're not supposed to report it in the text too, but people do this oftentimes. And I will say that sometimes reading figures and tables on their own can be challenging. And I think that is a skill that you build over time. And if it's something that's new to you, I would recommend looking at the text to give additional context and detail. And so usually when we include or write up the results, we will reference the figures and tables in parentheses. And so if you search a paper, if you're looking at, figure 1 and you're not sure what it's supposed to be telling you, you can search the paper for figure 1 and find the part in the text of the results that mentions it, and it will give a verbal description of what that figure is referencing. And so it can be helpful to look at the figure and the text at the same time to really give you that extra context. Something that you will see a lot in the results, especially for quantitative studies, which is what we will be reviewing today, are p-values. So this is a statistical value for a test, and it tells you whether or not something is statistically significant. So a p-value less than 0.05 is considered significant. And I will spare you all the nitty-gritty details of this, but essentially it means it's telling us how confident we are that this result is not a mistake, or that it was not found by random error. because our statistics account for, there being random effects. And so we can never have 100% certainty that what we found is completely true or real or representative of the population. And so anything that is a p-value less than 0.05 tells us we have reasonable suspicion that this is real and that this is a true effect that we're finding. So when you're looking through tables and the text of the results, authors will typically highlight when a result is considered significant or when the p-value is less than 0.05. And this will be helpful in figuring out, okay, is there a difference between these groups or not? So as you read through the results, it's helpful to think about whether or not they support the hypotheses that the authors state in the introduction. So are we seeing things in the results that are consistent with what they thought they would see? And a good study will report non-significant findings as along with their significant findings. So there can be an issue in academic research where we want flashy significant findings, and it's hard to get non-significant findings published because journal editors think, well, big whoop, you found nothing. But it's not nothing, right? It's important for us to know when groups are not different. And so a good paper will discuss significant and non-significant findings, at least in my opinion. Someone is asking for an example of null results. So that would be, and actually we can go through this in the sections when we look at the results of the PMC paper. But I think a good example of a null result would be, let's say if we came up with a new medication for Alzheimer's disease and it was not effective at all. So we tested the effect of this new medication on memory performance. And we compared people who got the medicine to people who didn't get the medicine, and they didn't differ at all, meaning that there was really no improvement in memory after getting the medication. That would be a null finding. Okay, then lastly, there is the discussion. And this is where the authors really synthesize what they found and integrate it with what's already been done in the literature and really give you kind of broad conclusions about what these findings mean. So the first paragraph of the discussion, I gotta say, is one of the most important parts of a paper. And if I am going to read a scientific paper and I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to look at the abstract. I'm going to look at the last paragraph of the introduction, and I'm going to look at the first paragraph of the discussion, because everything that is outlined in painstaking detail in the results section is typically summarized in the first paragraph of the discussion. So if reading the results section feels overwhelming for you, like this is too much information, I do not understand or care about this level of detail, try the first paragraph of the discussion, because typically they're going to restate everything in kind of more plain language and really give you a nice brief summary. The other paragraphs of the discussion are, or they should, interpret the results in the context of what's already known. So is this the first study to find these results or not? Have other people found something similar or something different? Do we, feel that we have a lot of confidence in these results, or are there reasons why maybe we don't? And then based on that, most authors will suggest future studies that can answer any remaining questions. And this helps sort of guide where we're going for future research. Usually the second to last paragraph in the discussion will touch on weaknesses or limitations of the study. So we like to encourage scientists to be humble. And so we make them outline exactly what was wrong with their study. And so there are always going to be limitations. No study is perfect. And this is where the authors will really kind of come clean and say, listen, we feel good about this work. We think it demonstrates this, and we think this is interesting and important, but we didn't include any people with this rarer kind of variant of this disease, or we weren't able to administer more tests of this outcome than we wanted to do. And so there will always be limitations that are addressed that help us sort of figure out, okay, does that change how I feel about the results? Does it make me more or less confident in what they found? But it should be balanced out with saying, but we think this is a pretty good study, and here's why. And then oftentimes the final paragraph will really zoom out and give these broad implications, summarize the importance of the study. And so just like how the introduction starts very broad and gets more narrow, the discussion is going to sort of start more narrow and get broad as it goes along. So as you're reading the discussion, things to ask yourself, do you agree with the author's interpretations? Do you think that they're minimizing or downplaying their limitations or their weaknesses? Do they do a good job of identifying these? So there are a few other sections that are worth briefly touching on. There's typically a reference section at the end after the discussion that lists every paper that they cite. So this is often published work that's relevant to the study, either because it's on the same topic or because it sort of gives more detail on the measures that were included, like surveys or processes for like blood processing and MRIs and things like that. These can either be in alphabetical order or in the order in which they're cited, depending on the journal. And this is a great way to identify other articles that you might be interested in. So if you read a paper and you find the topic especially interesting, the reference section, is essentially a list of things you should read. So I will often go through and check the reference section to see, like, okay, if I want to know more, which of these papers should I read next? There's usually also a section on disclosures or conflicts of interest. And so a lot of times scientists will develop consulting relationships with pharmaceutical companies or other corporate entities, and they are obligated to report these to journals when they publish. Because if you work as a consultant for a big pharma company and you're writing a paper on, the impact of a medication on cognitive performance, you might be a little bit biased, especially if you're writing on the drug that they make. And so in order to try to keep everybody honest, authors will report their conflicts of interest here, and just be totally transparent about that. Sort of other things to consider when you're reading a paper are what journal it's published in. So there are ways that the scientific community kind of measures the strength of a journal, and not every journal is considered equal. So there are some journals that are considered high impact, and this is referring to what's called an impact factor, which means that if you publish in this paper, everybody's going to read it, a ton of people are going to cite it, and you are now a success in your field. So these are journals like Science, Nature, New England Journal of Medicine. So they are, journals that have been around for a while, very well established. They have, the all-stars of the field as their editorial board, and they're very hard to get a paper published in. And so a factor that you can also look up, so impact factors are published every year, and you can look them up and determine as an author, do I want to publish here or not? But as a reader, it also helps you to understand, like, how important is this finding and how hard was it to get this paper published here? Because high impact journals have very low acceptance rates. We're talking like Ivy League university level acceptance rates. So they also publish these, and it can be useful to know, how common is it to get a paper published in this journal if you submit one? How competitive is it? And so typically when we're reading a paper, if we look up things like the impact factor and the acceptance rate, it tells us, how rigorous was this study, and it's a good metric of within the scientific community, kind of how good is this paper. And then, I also want to just highlight a few things about the author list. So on the title page, you'll see a list of everyone who contributed to the paper. And sometimes you'll see papers where there are like 30, 40 authors. And it's really hard to imagine, how do all these people get together and write a paper It seems kind of impossible. And in truth, it sort of is. So essentially, when you see a long list of authors for a scientific paper, it's typically the first author that does most of the work. So this is the person who leads the project, typically comes up with the idea, and writes most of the paper. The middle authors contribute in smaller ways. So these are collaborators. They're people who, may run the MRI lab or the blood bank. And so they're people who, without them, the paper would not have happened. But they may not really have thought through the idea or even written a section of the paper, but they're essential for the work. And so they become a co-author. And then oftentimes, this varies by field, but in our field, medical research, the final author is the most senior, or the person who we would say owns the data or directs the lab. And so this is often a sort of head honcho or the person who's considered sort of most important or most senior on the project. All right, so at this point, we have covered the sort of gross anatomy of a research paper, and I'm going to hand it over to Lauren, who's going to give us some pointers for reading research papers.
Thanks, Emma. We can go to the next slide. I think one of the main pointers that will then kind of guide the rest of your reading is why are you reading this paper? What are you hoping to get from this paper? Which will then guide where you'll find the critical information in relation to the specific question that you have. So Emma and I could read the same paper, but because we have similar backgrounds, well, similar interests, different backgrounds, we're probably going to read papers a little bit different from each other. I'm more interested in caregiver outcomes, and so I may be looking specifically throughout the paper for how were caregivers included in this research and what were their outcomes, and maybe not look as deep into which patient population or, well, I have dementia, but the patient population, the patient outcomes. Sometimes I'm reading a paper just because I want to know the methods. So it's a new methodology that I have never heard before, but maybe I want to now apply it to my research. And so I'm specifically going to be looking for that. So to start off, as Emma just went through wonderfully, you can kind of expect to find each of these chunks of information in very specific areas. So what is the purpose of the study? Almost always it should be the last paragraph of the introduction, and this is where they'll go over their aims and their hypotheses specific for this research. Who is included in the study? This is going to be the participant section of the methods. That's kind of like their outline of who did they want to include. And then table one in the results is who did they actually include and how many of each of those different populations. What are the independent variables? So what were their main outcomes that they were looking at will be in the statistical analysis section of the methods. And then finally, the main findings. I think Emma did a great job pointing out that first paragraph of the discussion is often sometimes the easiest to read to get a full picture. And so starting there can be really helpful. Next slide. And then broadly, think critically. Don't assume that these authors are always correct. Authors are always coming from their own unique perspectives. And so they may be looking at a question in a different way than perhaps you would. And so ask questions of how would you have gone about answering the question that they're trying to answer. It may not always be the same as what's been written in this paper. But based off of how they've described how they want to do it, is it logical? Did they include the right population? Did they include the right tests, whether it be surveys or blood biomarkers, imaging? Are there other things that maybe you would have included? And then read actively. So after you read each section, try to summarize it in like one or two sentences just to get the gist of it. You can take notes, you can highlight. What were some of the good ideas in the paper? What were maybe some of the bad ideas in the paper? And how can you apply this knowledge to other areas as well? And then finally, as Emma also said, I don't know everything when I'm reading papers. Like often I'm reading papers that are outside of my expertise. And so I will look up and Google words or try to find other papers that perhaps they've even cited in their paper to give me more background as to that method or that patient population.
Yeah, and I will also say that now there are a ton of AI tools that also I think can be useful. I'll give a similar caveat to Googling things. AI tends to reduce the nuance when it summarizes things. But now if you open a paper in Adobe Acrobat or another program, it may even say, would you like an AI assistant to summarize this for you? And I think that if you're somebody who feels like they're missing a lot or like some of the paper is too dense or technical, tools like that can actually be really useful. And so I would say read it yourself, but also make use of these tools and see, if your understanding differs from what's included in those kinds of summaries. The other thing is that when I was training, we still printed everything out and we would use highlighters and mark up our papers. And I think it's less common these days, but I think it's actually better to read a paper that way and be able to take notes in the margins and add question marks and stars and things you want to refer back to. And so I think being active when you're reading, either by note taking or highlighting or, um, you know, talking to people about it is really helpful.
Okay, so now we're going to jump into the article. It is okay if you did not read it before today. We're going to kind of walk through each section together. Um, we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible by using the chat, and both Emma and I will be watching that as you guys answer questions. Um, so feel free to please write thoughts, questions as we're going through each section. But today we'll be going through an original research report called Awareness of Mild Cognitive Impairment and Mild Alzheimer's Disease Dementia Diagnoses Associated with Lower Self-Ratings of Quality of Life in Older Adults. It's a long title, but I do think it does do a very good job of kind of giving us already an idea of what are they studying? What are some of the variables that we're looking at? Hopefully, some of these people in the left look familiar to you either from clinic or working in research with us. But this is really a great kind of interdisciplinary collaboration to put this piece together. So go ahead, Emma.
One thing before I change
Yeah.
slides that I do want to highlight, we didn't mention before, is that on these title pages, you'll
Oh, yeah.
see all of the authors of the paper and their affiliations. But typically there is one author who's identified as the corresponding author. And that's, often going to be first or last. In this case, it's Dr. Karlowish. And he might not appreciate me telling you this, but if there is something about a paper that you either want to comment on or you have questions about, they list the corresponding author's email address in every paper. And so as a corresponding author, I have published papers and I've had people email me about them. They're like, I read your paper and I don't understand why you did this. Sometimes they're complimentary, other times they're not. But it is well within your right to email the corresponding author of a research paper and ask them questions or make comments on their work. That is sort of the role of the corresponding author is, if people want to know more, that's why we publish their email addresses. So just something to think about as you're going forward. And, if you read something you really want to get a little more information about or share your opinions about, that is there for you.
I'll add to that too, thank you, Emma, that a lot of papers are still behind paywalls. And so if you're not wanting to pay for an article, sometimes reaching out to the author and letting them know that you're interested in their work, they can send you a PDF of their work. So just like a little way to get around some of the paywalls, if after you read the abstract, you're like, oh, I want to read this full thing, you can reach out to the author that way.
Yeah, that's a great point. People do that to me all the time, and I'm always happy to send people a PDF of the paper.
And to answer the high impact, I'm trying to very quickly look up the actual impact factor. I would say the Gerontological Society of America it's a reputable journal. It's not quite like Nature or Science or New England Journal of Medicine. Like Emma pointed out, it's probably like our toppest, our most top tier. But GSA is a very well-known national society, interdisciplinary society, and so I would say that they're um, very quickly, their 2022 impact factor was 5.7, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
Um,
So it is a numeric value. And for really small fields, niche subject areas, you might see an impact factor of like 1.5. And even though that's lower, it may be just because it's a small field. But you may also see low quality journals with, an impact factor of zero point 0.8 or 1. And that usually tells you that they're probably not getting a ton of high quality competitive submissions. And so a really, really strong impact factor is going to be like over 10. All right, can move on to looking at the introduction of this paper.
So, as Emma talked about in the anatomy of a paper, it's kind of like you could say a funnel or even a sand clock where we start broad, we go narrow, and then we kind of go back out again. And so this intro, I think, does a very good job of exemplifying this of each paragraph, we keep getting more narrow and narrow and narrow on the background information that is imperative for readers to have while they're reading why this research was important. So starting off, this might be a little bit difficult with the chat, but could anybody add to the chat, like what was something that you read in this first or second paragraph, perhaps that is common knowledge or something that is probably more broad knowledge for the public reading this? That's okay, Emma, if you want to just click. I've underlined a couple of the main
Yep.
areas. So really bringing attention to the prevalence and seriousness of Alzheimer's disease dementia and its impact on, specifically in this paper, the United States. That's kind of the big picture that this first paragraph is trying to tell us is this is important. This affects a lot of people. The next paragraph focuses us in a little bit more of kind of what are we doing about dementia? What are the possible either therapeutics or interventions that we are trying to create for Alzheimer's disease? And then it introduces a new concept, mild cognitive impairment, and leads us into this. We're starting to diagnose people earlier and earlier, where before often the term was just dementia for everyone, but now we have this term mild cognitive impairment. And through early detection, we may be able to give people earlier interventions and perhaps even delay or prevent dementia from ever starting. And so that's kind of what the second paragraph is bringing us to. And then go ahead and click, Emma.
Mhm.
So what it points to, and I kind of jumped out of order here, but the knowledge gap is often introduced at the end of a paragraph, probably depending on how many paragraphs are in an introduction, like the third paragraph is going to be a knowledge gap that will then bring us into their purpose and why they're doing the research. But so a big concept in dementia slash just uh, living is quality of life. I'm sure that we've all heard this term in various domains, and it's a very broad term. And so that's where they will define quality of life in a subsequent paragraph because it is very broad. But they want to start off by pointing out that as we are diagnosing people earlier and earlier, what does that mean for people's quality of life? Is it affecting it at all? It's a question that has not been answered, and that's what this little paragraph points out, is that few studies have actually examined how quality of life is affected at the mild cognitive impairment stage. And one more click. And then finally, I just wanted to point out as like a tip, often really important terms or terms that they're going to keep using throughout a paper are put in parentheses as a acronym. And so sometimes in that same area, they'll give you a definition for it as well. But so quality of life, we're going to start referring to as QOL, normal cognition, NC, and etc. But if you ever are reading, like perhaps you decided to start with reading the discussion section just because you wanted to read that first paragraph of what's like, why should I read this? There might be a lot of acronyms in that. And if you go back to the introduction, you'll see what those acronyms were. Go ahead, Emma.
Mhm.
So, like I said, quality of life is probably something you've heard of. We all probably have our own unique definitions for it. And so they very specifically here call out how they are defining quality of life in this study. And then as we get to the methods, they'll tell us how are they going to measure that. Um, and so specifically here, they point out that they're going to use a framework for quality of life that integrates cognitive functioning, physical functioning, social interactions, mental well-being, and mood. A lot of components that we'll get into in the methods. And then finally, as they've pointed out that they're wanting to study quality of life, they're now telling us what do we already know about quality of life in MCI? They earlier alluded that there hasn't been much research conducted in this space. But in this section, they talk about that the information that has been collected so far is kind of different depending on which papers you read. So there's been differing outcomes, and that's why they think that this research is important to kind of help unify the field around how is quality of life affected and why might there be differences in these papers. So one more click. So the purpose of this study, the last paragraph of the introduction is the purpose is to understand how diagnostic category and awareness of that diagnosis impact the quality of life in individuals with mild cognitive impairment and mild Alzheimer's disease as compared to typical individuals. They do also go on to give some of their hypotheses of what they expect to see, which is also really helpful for when we're reading the results of did their assumptions coming into this study were they met or did they find something else? I'm going to pause there just because I know I'm just talking at you a lot through this introduction. Does anybody have questions or comments about how they've set up this introduction? And just a broad question for the chat as well is, did this help give you background to the study? Do you feel like you have somewhat of an idea of why they're curious about this question? Okay.
We've got a well done. Stephen is raising his hand, Allison. I don't know if it's okay to.
Yes, I can unmute you, Stephen. Hang on one second.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yep, we can hear you.
Yep. Yes. First off, thank you very much. I'm finding this very interesting. Um, I'm looking at the current slide that you've got there and just reading through the paragraph above on the right hand where you've highlighted, and it says other studies have not found a relationship at all or identified only weak associations between severity, blah, 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 blah. Reading that, based upon what you've gone through earlier, I would immediately say these guys don't know what the hell they're talking about. I mean, that statements like that, it means somebody really isn't plugged into the real world environment of people with cognitive impairment.
hmm
Yeah,
Yeah,
So,
and
and
that would
that's
be. Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead, Emma. No,
Uh,
please.
that's the kind of perplexing thing about research sometimes is that we get what we think of as like counterintuitive results, where we would expect to see an obvious association between something like, cognitive decline and quality of life. And I think that the authors then point out, why that might be. So methodologic shortcomings, these limitations of those prior studies, maybe why they didn't find that association that common sense would tell you should exist,
and
right?
you did, yes, and you did qualify that earlier when you were speaking. You're right.
Uh,
I got it now. Thank
and
you.
no problem. And I would guess that the sentence before this probably says some studies have found this. I don't remember
The
completely.
sentence to the bottom left is actually the continuation. So you are correct. They have shown some, but not all domains of quality of life may be impacted by cognitive decline.
So this is what we would call like a mixed findings, where some researchers have found evidence of an effect and others have not. And so this is whenever there's mixed findings in the literature, that's a justification for wanting to know more and doing another study to see if we can clarify and be less equivocal.
I just want to compliment too that you like questioned like why would this be and kind of listen to your gut. That's a lot of reading these papers is if you're reading results and you're like, this just does not fit with what my knowledge is of this area, can then help you start thinking about, well, why might that be? Why might I be seeing something different than what these scientists are reporting? So that was a great example of how to read an introduction section. Okay, I think we can move on briefly into the methods then.
Okay.
So, starting off from the methods, what we really want to know is who's being studied. How are we going to answer this broad question that they just introduced in the introduction section? So, briefly, if you want to write in the chat, I'll give a couple seconds. But who did they enroll in this study? Yes, thank you, Jean. Who were maybe some of the main cohorts or groups of participants that they included? All right, you can click Emma, and I will give it away.
Mhm.
As they also said in the introduction, they are interested in mild stage Alzheimer's disease, mild cognitive impairment, and normal cognition or normal controls. And they have about an even distribution across these different cohorts. So N stands for sample size. So how many people did they include? So they had 68 people with mild stage Alzheimer's disease, 92 with MCI, and 99 with normal cognition. Longitudinal cohort. Yes, that's a great question. So there's a couple different ways that we do research. The two kind of like main, I'm going to call like timelines of research is cross-sectional or longitudinal. A longitudinal cohort is what's very common at a lot of these memory centers, especially here at Penn. So we want to watch how a disease may progress somewhat naturally, or if they're in an intervention, over time. And so we look at it longitudinally, meaning we are going to collect the same tests, whether it's surveys or biomarkers, being blood or MRI, across a period of time so that we're able to have a long or longitudinal view of the progression of a disease. This can be anywhere you have a visit once a year. A longitudinal visit could also be conducted just in 1 year, but you're coming at multiple time points. Versus cross-sectional is just looking at one point in time. So perhaps maybe before you're diagnosed with a disease or you're in the middle of a disease, we're looking at just a one time point. Like, so right now, how are you doing on a happiness scale or on your imaging? So when they talk about the longitudinal cohort here, that is what the Penn Memory Center, their main research is a longitudinal cohort where people are coming back year after year after year to get the same tests done.
Yeah.
Did
And
that
cohort is
help?
just a fancy term for group.
Yeah.
So it's a group of people who have been studied longitudinally over time. This study in particular really is cross-sectional in nature because it's taking that sample or group of people who have been enrolled in research at the Memory Center, who have been followed over time, and they're picking one time point where they answered questions about their quality of life and awareness of their diagnosis and impairment. And so it's a little bit confusing, but this is a longitudinal group or cohort of people, but it's a snapshot or a cross-sectional study.
Um, and then we touched on this, but is there a control group here? Is there a comparison group? Um, and I'll just jump to keep us moving. Yes, it's the normal cognition. So we're wanting to compare our mild cognitive impairment, our mild stage Alzheimer's disease to people with essentially with no changes in their memory. And as we get to the inclusion and well, actually in the participants, it tells us how did they define what Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment were, as well as what did they consider normal cognition. As we move to how are they selected? And Emma, please correct me, but we actually have a normal cognition group as part of the longitudinal data at the Penn Memory Center. So they get a lot of the same tests that people that are in the longitudinal cohort with either Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment, they're getting the same tests. The difference is just that they do not have a known neurodegenerative disease or even are at risk for a are at risk for a neurodegenerative disease. But they're often, as Emma pointed out in the beginning, we want a cohort that's similar in other ways. So they're normally the same age group, similar backgrounds, so that we're not comparing like a 12-year-old to a 65-year-old, especially for cognition purposes. There's a lot of reasons why a 12-year-old is going to be different than a 65-year-old. And so we can't really definitively say that it's because they have a neurodegenerative disease.
Yep.
Just to keep us moving through this, I'm going to briefly go through the eligibility. So there's always a section after participants of now more specifically, we have the population that we're interested in. How are we going to select those people? And so from the longitudinal cohort, they specifically chose people that were over the age of 65. They're English speakers, at least have a sixth grade education. And then the mini mental state exam is a way of assessing the severity of neurodegenerative diseases. And so, like they said, they wanted mild stage Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment, which the cutoff for both of those is a score of 20 or higher. Something I just want to point out for the eligibility is that they did, just for some things that might be missing. We can't include everybody in all of these studies. Often that's going to be superfluous and not even answer our research question. But often something that unfortunately we end up missing is because we often ask for English speakers. People of other backgrounds are often excluded from studies. This is mainly because of a lot of our assessments are in English, and then a lot of our assessors are English speakers. But it does limit who we are testing for these protocols. And then this was also an interesting one where they asked, they did all these assessments at home. So you had to live within an hour of the Penn Memory Center in order to have these tests done. So this does, again, we're kind of like narrowing the group of people that we're specifically looking at for this research. All right, next. So the next sections go into how did we measure the different variables that we wanted to study. Again, I'm going to keep moving through this so that we can get to the meat of it, which is the discussion. So they did participant interviews. Go ahead and click, Emma.
Mhm.
And one big part of these interviews was assessing people's awareness of their diagnosis. So that was a big part of this question was, is being aware of your diagnosis, does that affect your quality of life? So they had a series of questions that they asked to assess somebody's awareness. And if they answered yes to any of these questions, they were deemed as, quote, aware. Go ahead to the next section. And then as you read through this measures section, or if you didn't, they used a ton of measures to get at different aspects of cognition and memory. And this is one of the proponents of doing longitudinal cohort studies is you're collecting so much data. And if anybody here is a research participant, I'm sure that you're aware. You do a lot of surveys with us. And this shows that we do use a lot of these surveys in our publications. And so I just wanted to point out one of them because this one has probably one of the larger statistical significant results in the end is the dementia quality of life scale. So this is a scale that gets at different components of quality of life, like they introduced in the introduction section that we kind of have different domains of quality of life. And so this covers your feelings, your everyday life, and your memory, and broadly just how did you feel in those different categories. But then they also have one final large question of just taking it all together, how do you feel your overall quality of life is? So they give you an opportunity for you to assess overall quality of life, but then also these domains that fit into the broader picture. Um, just to point out some of the other main areas that they have measures for, they measured memory, they measured global cognition, they measured executive function, as well as some functional ADLs. Next. And then finally, in the methods, they talk about what are their independent and dependent variables. This is a little bit harder to pull out, but and we can even go ahead and click the next one just to really highlight where it is. Based off of the introduction and now this methods section, what do we think that the independent variable is? And some of the key terms that Emma pointed out earlier was the effect of something on something else. So,
Whatever having the effect would be our independent.
which I'll give it away. Our independent variable is one's belief about their prognosis, or their awareness is another word that they use throughout this paper. And then the outcome, or the dependent variable, is those various domains of quality of life. And then just one other thing I pointed out, which will probably come up in the results section as well, Emma, if you want to click, is you'll sometimes see this language of we controlled for something or we have covariates. These are different variables that the scientists think may be important to answering their question, but it maybe wasn't their primary independent variable. They want to make sure it's included because they recognize that this could be an influential variable on the outcome. And so this is just kind of us checking all of our boxes to make sure that we are including things that we know from the literature could be having an effect on our outcome. This one in particular, so they controlled for patient gender. We'll see in the results that we did have different gender proportions in each of the groups of either mild cognitive impairment and mild AD. And so sometimes if you have some substantial differences in different variables like gender, you're going to include that as a control as well. And that's it. Moving on to results.
All right, so I'm going to pick it back up and we're going to talk about the results and discussion in the paper. So we want to know from the results section, what did they find? So we understand what they're trying to do. We understand a little bit about how they're doing it. And so here is really where we get to the meat of the paper, where they're going to present, exactly what they found. So table 1, as I mentioned earlier, is typically in human subjects research, summary of sample characteristics or different features of the groups that they studied. So we can see that they have our 3 groups are these columns, so normal controls, mild cognitive impairment, and Alzheimer's disease. And they start by showing us demographic features. So what, on average, how old were the participants in each group? And this gives us a helpful indicator that the value is the mean or the average. And then the number that is in parentheses is the standard deviation or the amount that it varied on average. And so this tells us really that these folks were about 78 or 79 years old. We see the number and then percent of women in each group. And so, as Lauren was saying, there is a significant difference here because this p-value is super small, way less than 0.05. So that's telling us that there is a group difference in terms of how many women were included in each group. And the sort of total number is less helpful here than the percent because they're sort of different denominators for how many people were in the groups overall. But we can see that the normal control group had almost 73% were women, whereas the MCI group was closer to 45%, and in the Alzheimer's group, it was more like 63. So this was something that then they go on to statistically control for covariate for because they want to be more sure that the results they find are not due to this difference in the gender breakdown. They also report the proportion of individuals who identify as African American. And this is important because a lot of research studies, especially in the United States, we tend to have disproportionately white research samples. And there are lots of reasons for this. It is something that we have, as a community, been really trying to proactively work against and try to include more people of color in our research samples to make them more representative of the broader population. But as you can see, we often have sort of underrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities in our research samples. And I think that's probably true here if we consider the demographics of sort of Philadelphia and the surrounding area. We can see that a majority of the samples were college graduates and a majority were right-handed. I'm not actually entirely sure why the handedness is included, but interesting to know. So I will say for this, they also give us a summary of their performance on a bunch of memory tests, their global cognitive performance, including this MMSE, which was used as part of the inclusion criteria. So everyone had to have a score greater than 20, and we see that, yep, indeed, all of our groups have scores greater than 20. And then these are other kind of cognitive domains or relevant variables. So, a tip about looking at a table like this, if you're not sure what it's supposed to be telling you, you can look for the paragraph in the results that references the table and it will give you more context. So it will actually spell out a lot of the significant results that are going to be, important to glean from a given table. So we can see that in the very first paragraph of the results section, they reference table 1. And they summarize, the groups did not differ on age, race, right-handedness, or percentage of college graduates. And then they helpfully tell us all of these p-values were greater than 0.05. So not statistically significant, not different. They go on to kind of summarize a little bit more about each group. But that is essentially telling us that's what this is for, is to give the reader a sense of the broad characteristics of the group. Another tip here is looking for these p-values that represent statistically significant differences. And so I've underlined any of the p-values that were statistically different. And this just helps us see, if I'm looking at a table, oftentimes that's where my eyes are going to go, is looking at the p-values to see, okay, I want to weed out what's not different from what is different. And this is going to help me see, what's the point they're really trying to demonstrate here. And that's that these groups were different in their memory performance, they were different in their global cognition, and their performance on other cognitive tests, which is exactly what we would expect, right? If we're looking at people who are healthy and normal with no dementia, no mild cognitive impairment, we would expect that they would perform better on memory tests and other cognitive tests, right? And similarly, between MCI and Alzheimer's disease, because these represent different stages, we would also expect that they would perform differently. What we maybe didn't expect is that there would be a difference in the sex distribution with more women in the normal control group in particular. And so that's something that we want to keep in mind as we sort of look through the rest of the results. So then we pulled out table 2. Because again, a lot of times these tables are including sort of primary or main findings that our authors really want us to know about. Because you can sort of make a decision as an author of what you're going to just put in the text and what you're going to make into a table. And oftentimes journals will have a limit on how many tables or figures you can include. So if you are taking the time to make it a table or a figure, it means it's important. So table 2, what is this table telling us? And all of the tables and figures should have a title. And this really summarizes what it should be telling us, right? So table 2, the title is Awareness of Diagnosis, Self-Reported Memory Problems, Quality of Life, Mental Well-Being, and Physical Functioning by Diagnostic Group. So these are a lot of these kind of outcome variables that the authors are interested in measuring. And here they are reporting if there are differences between the groups on these outcome measures. And so I've given us some visual cues here to identify significant results. If you feel confident or lucky, go ahead and type in the chat things that you notice are different between these groups. If you see something unexpected, like why would they be different on that? I'd be curious to know. But this is sort of our first major summary of, are these groups different in terms of how many of them believe they have a condition, how many of them believe that they have memory problems or that they expect their memory to get worse, how many of them are reporting, reduced quality of life, whether or not they're reporting mood or anxiety or stress symptoms, and then how they're functioning physically. How is their overall health and physical well-being. And I will say for this table as well, it may be useful to check the text. So if we're still not sure what it's trying to tell us, or what these differences mean, we can look to the text and the results and say, oh, this is about awareness of impairment and diagnosis by diagnostic label. So part of what they're telling us here is if you have Alzheimer's disease, how likely are you to report in an interview that you have Alzheimer's disease? And this to me is a little unexpected, and unfortunately the red line got deleted here. But this is an important finding, okay? This is, again, the number of participants, 23, and the percent of the whole group that said yes. So you might expect maybe more people in the Alzheimer's group would have said that they have Alzheimer's. But in fact, it's only about 34%. Now then we see below it is reports either having MCI or Alzheimer's, and there's a larger group there. So I suspect that between these two, this is really closer to maybe what we would expect. But we see that still even a lot of people are reporting having MCI, even when really they've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So awareness of diagnosis is one thing that we're seeing here. Marie has raised a question about anosognosia, which I think maybe is that, where do we see that? Is that in the text or is that somewhere else?
I think she might be questioning, is that the
Oh,
reason
oh,
for this difference?
Got
Yeah.
it. Yes, exactly. So anosognosia, for those who don't know, is a deficit in insight. So, and it's very common in Alzheimer's disease and even in mild cognitive impairment where people are not aware of their deficits. And for those of you who are caregivers for people with Alzheimer's, and I think this is a really common phenomenon and something that is incredibly challenging when you're trying to manage safety concerns and help someone understand why they're not allowed, to drive or do other activities anymore. And so, yeah, I would imagine that anosognosia or lack of insight is a huge contributing factor to why we see, that there are people in the Alzheimer's disease group who are not endorsing or saying to the interviewer that they have Alzheimer's. So, yeah, I think you're exactly right, Marie. Another thing I'll highlight from this table is that sometimes there can be important information hidden in the fine print. So tables and figures in journals are intended to stand alone, which means that every acronym you see in here has to be defined in the notes. And that includes these kind of superscript indicators, which tell us more information about which groups were different from each other. Because we have 3 groups. The p-value just tells you some group is different from another, but it doesn't tell you specifically which groups. And this sort of extra bit of information that we pull out from the table note tells us in detail that if there is an X next to a particular value, that means that this group is different. Well, here, I'll find one. The MCI group is different from the normal cognition group on cognitive functioning and quality of life. So that's what the X means, that that group is different from normal. Whereas the Y means they're different from MCI, and the Z means they're different from Alzheimer's disease. So this is just a way of really in a more detailed way telling you which groups are different from each other. Because just because the p-value is less than 0.05 does not mean that all 3 groups are different from each other. And there are times when we might expect, MCI and Alzheimer's disease to be different from normal controls, but not from each other, or vice versa. So then I wanted to pull out table 3 as well. And this one highlights some more kind of technical statistical details. And so I wanted to go into a little more detail on what this means. So here, this table, if we look to the text, is telling us about the impact of diagnostic label on relationships between memory impairment and quality of life. So that's like a lot of variables, right? And it's less clear from the way this is written, which one is independent, which one is dependent. So the paragraph gives you more information on really what they're trying to measure here. So they're saying that to assess whether or not the diagnostic label, so having MCI or Alzheimer's, affects the impact of the relationships between quality of life and memory impairment. They used a two-stage statistical model. So in the first stage, they wanted to know how much variability is explained in quality of life by memory impairment. So this stage one is really just saying, what is the relationship between memory impairment and quality of life? And then in the second stage, they wanted to see, okay, is this different or is it affected by the specific diagnostic label that a person has? And so, Stephen, I see your question. I'll get to it in just a second. This might not be totally clear. So we've looked to the text, we've read the table title, but maybe we still don't totally understand what this is saying or what they're doing. And here's where it can be helpful to ask Google or get an AI summary to help you understand a little bit more about what the statistics are really testing. So I will tell you, I'll be your Google today and say that R squared value, which is what we see here in this column for the first stage of the model, tells us how related two things are. And we can think about this as like a Venn diagram. So if we have two constructs, quality of life and memory impairment, we want to know to what degree do they overlap or how related they are. So if they're not related at all, they don't overlap even a little bit, then the R squared value is going to be 0. That means no relationship. If they are moderately associated, but there's still a fair amount about them that's different, they're going to have an R squared value that's maybe closer to 0.3, 0.4. If they are super related, like almost basically the same thing, then their R squared value is going to be close to 1. So 0.9, 0.85, sort of in that range. And so based on this as a guide, if we look at these R squared values, they don't seem that related, right? They're pretty small. And I think it looks like the highest one is 0.14, which, is significant, but it's not that impressive. And in fact, if we look at the p-values here, we see a lot of these effects are not even statistically significant. So this is telling us that when we look just at memory impairment and quality of life, they're not that related, and at some places not at all.
Which also, I would put out in the introduction, that's what they said previous research had shown.
That's right.
So this is consistent with what has been published, that it seems like there's not really anything related. So then
they want to see, okay, well, what if we account for diagnosis? And so then this change in R squared, or the delta R squared, tells us if we are improving our understanding of how these two things are related after accounting for a third variable. And so basically we're saying, okay, maybe the R squared, sorry, my dog is barking at something in the background. But if the R squared is really low, if we add in diagnosis, does it go up? Does it improve? So if we go from, let's say, an R squared of 0.01 to then an R squared of 0.1, and it goes from not being significant to then being significant, that's an improvement. So this is telling us that on the PSS, which is the perceived stress scale, adding in this variable of diagnosis really improves our understanding of how these two things are related. So essentially what they're saying is, yeah, when you just look at quality of life and memory impairment, there's not a very strong association. But when we account for diagnosis, then we start to see things that look a little bit more meaningful and that are statistically significant. And one of these areas that we see really jump up is the DEMQUAL. So the quality of life and dementia variable goes from a 0.3 to 0.15, and it goes from significant to even more significant after we add in diagnosis. So this is telling us and the authors that, okay, we're onto something here. This matters, the particular diagnosis that a person has. Okay, so now table 4, and this might be our final table. The dog's very excited about. And this one talks about self-reported memory problems, quality of life, mental well-being, and physical functioning by cognitive typicality and awareness of diagnosis. So these are now things that, cognitive typicality, I don't recall seeing in any of the slides before now. So if I were a reader of this for the first time, I might be like, what is this? Where did this come from? Why all of a sudden are we now interested in cognitive typicality? And this is where it becomes really helpful to know what the aims of the study are. And so to refer back to, understanding what's the purpose of this and why would they care about this? But essentially what they've done here is, instead of looking at the different sort of diagnostic groups, they've divided people up into whether or not they believe they are normal or not. And so now we're looking at awareness of cognitive change and how that affects quality of life and these other variables as well. And this is the table that, if you look in the PDF, it's turned sideways, which is just like so irritating. You've got to like rotate the page every time you want to look at it or turn your head. So I thought, it really is helpful to look at the text for this. It's also kind of a busy and large table. So here we're seeing that, on average, the groups that were unaware, or the people that were unaware that they had a diagnosis, had greater satisfaction with their everyday life. So on this quality of life and Alzheimer's disease measure, people were reporting that they were, generally more satisfied the less aware they were of their condition, and less difficulty in daily life related to health, well-being, cognitive functioning, social relationships. So all of these are domains measured by the DIM-QoL. And so essentially what they're saying is that those with more anosognosia or less insight into their condition actually have a better quality of life. There seems to be a protective effect of not quite understanding or fully appreciating, really how much you have changed, and, that you have a diagnosis that might get worse over time. In contrast, they say the group that was aware of their diagnostic label was much more likely to believe that their symptoms would worsen over time compared to the group that was unaware of their diagnosis. And so they're interested in knowing, if you are aware, does that extend to realizing that it's going to get worse? And in fact, it appears that it does. So this may be part of the reason why people who have less insight or less awareness into their diagnosis have a higher quality of life, because maybe they're less concerned about the future. And actually, if we go back to the table, we can really see this kind of bear out in terms of expects memory to worsen. So there was a higher proportion. They're really saying that between the believe they're normal and diagnosed group, that there is a significant difference there. Okay, at any rate, those were the main findings of the paper. So I want to stop here, and I did not answer Stephen's question, but he says, got it. So let me know if I, in fact, did not get it, and we can return to that. But at this point, I think we can probably move on to the discussion, where we can really see how the authors put all of this together and understand what it is that their results were telling them. So these are the first 2 paragraphs of the discussion. I will say, for all of the crowing I did about the first 2 paragraphs, I think that this author group actually left sprinkled in sort of other significant findings throughout the discussion, and instead of kind of really summarizing everything that was important in the first 2 paragraphs. So this is just a way to show that, no 2 scientific papers are exactly alike, or going to follow the same template or format, but it just gives us more reason to read all of the other paragraphs. So here in these first 2 paragraphs, we are seeing, they're telling us that they saw that the Alzheimer's group and mild cognitive impairment group had sorry, they were similar in their awareness of their memory problems, and that they were reporting a lower quality of life. So these were things I think they kind of expected, and were not a big surprise, and maybe consistent with prior literature. But then they say in the second paragraph, the NCI group actually reported worse emotional well-being compared to the dementia group and the normal cognitive group. Which in a disease, we often think that the more severe the disease is, the worse a person's quality of life is going to be. And here, what we're showing is that that doesn't seem to be true for Alzheimer's disease. And in fact, this less severe stage of mild cognitive impairment, these folks seem to have worse quality of life compared to even people with a more severe stage. So they had higher depressive symptoms, lower overall mental well-being, and greater situational stress. Then these middle paragraphs is where the authors are going to do a lot of interpreting and integrating their results with the prior studies that have been done in this area. So we can see here on the left, anytime you see things like our findings are consistent with, or this is inconsistent with, this is a signal they're going to sort of talk about or integrate their findings with other people's work. And so they acknowledge that the research in this area has been really limited, but that in some ways their findings were consistent with what other people have found. In the paragraph on the right, another important thing that good authors, especially for clinical research, will do is tie it back into what we see in the clinic room. So what are the clinical implications of this study? And so the authors are really linked in with the sort of current state of the field. And so they're saying, we are seeing a lot of advances in diagnosis and treatment of Alzheimer's. And so now we're having people who may have no symptoms at all, but who have been told that they have Alzheimer's disease, either from a scan or a blood test or a genetic test. And so for these people who are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, awareness of that could contribute to, reduced quality of life, more depression, more perceived stress. And this is something that as a field and as clinicians, we're going to have to deal with and understand, the consequence of communicating this information to people who may not even have symptoms yet. And so they're really, I think, doing a very nice job of kind of tying in their findings with the real world and trying to consider, what does this tell us about how we should be treating these people, and what's sort of the right move here. And then the last few paragraphs of discussion, this is where you will typically find these limitations or weaknesses of a study, and then suggestions for additional studies or future research that should be conducted. So they do highlight that the study was done at a single site, and this might be considered a limitation, especially now we're in an age where a lot of studies are done at multiple centers across the country. So, at Penn, we do a lot of collaborative multi-site research. So you may analyze data from people who were, studied in San Francisco or in Chicago. And so collecting a group only at Penn nowadays is considered a limitation or a weakness of some studies. It also talks about how the results might not generalize to populations with other characteristics. And this is kind of a brief way of saying we don't have a ton of diversity in our sample. And so we can really only say what we know about people who are mostly white, mostly college educated, and who live in the greater Philadelphia area. And then they also note that they didn't test any hypotheses about mediating variables. And that means that there could be other things we didn't measure, or things we did measure, but we haven't analyzed yet, that could account for some of the associations that we saw. And in fact, at a certain point, it may be right after this, they say, we're going to do that in a second paper. And so it's telling the reader, we know it would make sense to include some of that here, but don't worry, it's coming. So look for it in the future. I will also say that sometimes because academic papers are what's called peer reviewed, which means that before they can get published in a journal, they have to be read and critiqued by another group of scientists who often have their own agendas and their own priorities. That if you ever feel like you see something in a research paper and you're like, what is this doing here? This is not what they planned to do. It's not in their aims. It's not something that was really well described or set up by the introduction. Sometimes it's because a reviewer has requested that they do that. And this happens pretty often. And so sometimes also reviewers will make you put in limitations that you might not think are limitations. So our work and the way that it's written really is guided by that peer review process. And that can explain sometimes some of these question marks that are like, why did they do that? Or why did they say it like that? Well, sometimes the reviewer made them. They also put in this sort of concluding section, future directions or areas of research that they think will be important or questions that still need answering. So we still don't understand why some patients are unaware and others aren't. And so these are things that we sort of really need to investigate further. And sometimes this is a justification for, writing another paper. And so oftentimes we can get a hint at what an author might be working on next by looking at their future directions. And then a lot of papers will include a broad summary that links it, kind of zooms back out and gets to the bottom of that hourglass. And this is a good indicator. So in sum, it's usually a good tip-off that we're about to get a nice brief summary of the findings. And this can just help kind of tie everything together and help the reader really feel like, they have a decent synopsis of what they found and why it's important. So this is a sort of another good place to look after that first paragraph of the discussion is really sort of the last paragraph or one of the last paragraphs where you can find these summaries. So before we wrap up or hop off for today, I did want to sort of see and get a sense from you guys. And I think that we can talk about this in the chat. I think that it seems like if people want to come off of mute, that's also okay to talk about some of these discussion questions. But I'm curious to know, from your perspective, do you think that these results or their findings were clearly explained? Were they hard to understand? Were there some things that were easier than others? Was it, a challenging experience? And I'll say even for myself that I often find reading papers and understanding exactly what they're getting at to be a challenging experience.
I will confess, I did not read the paper beforehand because life is just nuts, but I appreciate your guidance as we go through. I think that's fantastic. Both of you together. It's really great.
Thank you
So
so
I
much.
just wanted to be clear about that.
Well, thank you. We appreciate
Yeah,
it. And we
thanks.
totally understand that life gets in the way.
Yeah.
I feel the same way. I have read papers before, and I have not, I have not taken statistics, the course, like basic statistics. So it's always been a big barrier, a big fence for me in understanding. This was so helpful. I
It
really
was
appreciate it very much.
definitely.
It's really great. And I think it's interesting that the people with MCI had more distress, even though they were functioning normally. And that may be exactly why they were struggling to continue to function normally. And the study, like, sussed that out, like, really demonstrated that, I mean, I don't, there were so many different measures of cognitive and emotional performance or states. I couldn't, it would take a lot of time to understand all those different tests, but it was very interesting. As far as weaknesses, I started thinking about the fact that um, what about the large rural population who are less educated,
Hmm.
and then the lack of diversity? Those are things that kind of really play into the
Mm.
polarization, that we see in the big, in our society.
Yep.
Um, so that's interesting. And I understand this is a single site study. So there's limitations automatically that limit the ability to make it really broad. But are there studies being done on rural populations, less educated populations?
That's a great question. And I think, for certain, there are large scale efforts to improve our studying of people who are less educated and who come from different backgrounds. But in terms of the um geographic location, most of the ones I know about are actually within cities.
Hmm.
Rural research is so tough to do because you need a research team that's willing to travel.
Hmm.
And there are studies that do that, but they are kind of the exception to the rule because most studies need to be anchored to a medical center, where people can do the MRIs and they can do things like that. But there are some studies, they will send a person to your house to draw your blood. They will, in fact, at the FTD Center, we used to have coordinators who would drive to the homes of our participants and test them in their homes to
Hmm.
reduce the burden of having to come into the center. But it's tough to do, and there are a lot of logistic barriers there. But you're absolutely right that there are so many reasons why an urban, highly educated population may be different, and these effects might look different in different groups. And we know in particular that racial and ethnic minorities can be more likely to view memory loss as a normal part of aging, and Alzheimer's disease as something that is, not pathological but common, and it shapes how you view, the amount of distress you're going to encounter around
Hmm.
memory loss, and the amount that you worry about the future. Groups that have intergenerational homes where it's very common for, children to take care of their parents in the same home and live there with their own kids, three generations all at once. I think those groups have less anxiety and concern about, their own future when they have memory loss because they're more cared for at home in a traditional sense. So these things are all incredibly important, and you raised like such a good point about that. I wish that we were able to say that there are more studies of rural populations and people who are different from our samples, but it's something we're still working on.
Mm. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
We have a question in the chat, Emma, broadly about kind of how to assess peer review
Mm.
at journals and like how to assess legitimacy or credibility of a paper. If it's mainly the impact factor, how can they find that information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, peer review, unfortunately, is like a little bit of a black box. People don't often publish data on this, and even as an author, when your paper gets reviewed, you don't know who reviewed it. And A few brave souls will sign their names to their reviews, but they're usually anonymous, and so there's no accountability for bad reviews. And a lot of times, like a senior author may be asked to review a paper, and they kind of pass it off to their postdoc or their graduate student who maybe doesn't have as much experience doing that and may, miss things or, um, be overly critical of things that are actually, okay. And so that is a really tough part of the process. And I think, especially as people get more overworked and overburdened, fewer people want to review papers because we don't get paid for that. So that is like a service to the community when we do it. And so it is kind of a weak link in the whole system, I will say. But other ways you might sort of interrogate the quality of a paper, you can look at how many people have cited it. And if you search, so Google has a search engine specifically for academic papers called Google Scholar. And you can often find free versions of paywalled papers on Google Scholar. But if you click on a particular author in Google Scholar, it will show you all of their publications. And it'll give you metrics about them, including how many people have cited this paper. And that's one way of getting a sense of, how important was this paper in this field. If, say, 5 years after it was published, it's only been cited twice, that's like not a great indication. You would expect that after it's been out for a few years, if it's an important paper, it probably would have been published, 20, 30, 50 times. If it's really important, a lot more than that. And so that's one way you can look at it. But I would say that typically impact factor journal quality is the most common way of thinking about that.
I will just add too for peer review, a lot of journals have multiple peer reviewers for one article. So even if you get one like bad egg reviewer, hopefully the other one, or I just did some peer review. We had 4 peer reviewers on one article, which I thought was astronomical. That's fantastic. You can get kind of a diversity of backgrounds reviewing one topic, which I think helps with the rigor of the paper because somebody may be better with the statistics part of it, somebody may be better with the conceptual, theoretical aspect of the paper. But to Emma's point, peer review is a really difficult aspect of like academic writing right now. A lot of people don't want to do peer review. It takes a lot of time, especially to give thoughtful feedback. And now in the era of AI may be starting to do some peer review, which there's a whole debate about that of whether that's ethical. But um, it's not always the easiest to assess. There are some journals that will publish who the peer reviewers are, so that's another way that you can look at it. It would be published in the paper, like on the front page where the authors are, and then peer reviewed, but that's not very common.
Laurette has a comment about the anosognosia effect in the paper, saying it's not surprising, but maybe an area that should be explored further in the context of compassionate care and a means to support coping and well-being. And I think absolutely, I think this is part of what drives a lot of the advice we give to caregivers around not arguing with patients or correcting them when they make mistakes that are inconsequential or have beliefs that are not true. That the less aware someone is, the better it is in general just to sort of go with it and not challenge that because when you bring someone back into awareness, you can distress them, and it often is more compassionate and just a path of least resistance to go with it and not challenge that. And so I think you're absolutely right about that. And I would be curious to see how people with MCI might respond to something like that sort of approach to compassionate caregiving versus a more upfront or direct approach. And I think that that's an idea for a great paper.
I want to chime in here and echo what everyone has said so far to say thank you so much to Lauren and Emma for putting on a really informative presentation. For those of us who were not paying as close attention as they should in their research methods class, this was a great review. And it sounds like for those of us who did not have the opportunity to take that class, this was also a great intro. So thank you so much. We are so fortunate to have such a highly intelligent and resourced and expert members of the PMC and FTD Center with us today. We really can't thank you enough. I want to let everyone know that our next Empowering Caregivers will be on November 21st, right before Thanksgiving at 12 p.m. It is with the Disability Rights Pennsylvania Center with Haviv Traki-Vidal and Dale Verchik, who are staff attorneys at the Disability Rights Center, Pennsylvania. They'll be talking about how disability rights intersect with dementia care. So things like employment protection, laws that prohibit discrimination, self-advocacy tools, and the role of their organization, Disability Rights Pennsylvania. So as always, the registration for that is on our website at pennmemorycenter.org. You can go to programs and services and then Empowering Caregivers workshop series. And we will be posting the recording of this to our website shortly. So again, huge round of applause to Emma and Lauren. Thank you so, so much again. And thank you to everyone for taking a chunk of your Friday out to spend with us.
Yes, thanks so much for
Thank you so
attending.
much. This was great.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, thank you. And Allison, is it possible to send the slides
Yep.
to folks who register
Oh,
in case
great.
they
Great.
want to
I
use
would
those?
love that.
I
Yes.
need to go back over some of this.